Welcome everybody to this month's specifying practice group call. Before we get started with today's session, we have our usual housekeeping issues to remind everyone. First, your line is currently in listen-only mode. That means you are muted to prevent any background noise from being distracting to the other attendees, as well as the presenters on the call. This is done not only to prevent that disruption, but also because we do record the sessions. All recordings of the sessions are then edited down for any glitches or technical issues that happen throughout the call, and the final recording will be posted to the CSI YouTube channel. That's just youtube.com/CSIConstruction. That's all one word. The video usually is posted a few days after the recording, so in this case, look for it probably Monday morning or Monday afternoon, in case you want to go back and revisit the topic that we discussed today. Additionally, reminder to everybody that after this call, you will receive an email from me with a quick short survey link. That link allows you to give us feedback on how the topic went, the session in general, ideas you have for future sessions, and then also request a certificate for attending today's session. Our practice group calls are not submitted to AIA, as the conversation is meant to be open to the public to kind of interact with both Dave and Lewis, which they highly recommend. And therefore, we can never guarantee we'll get through all the objectives in the time period allowed. However, this session is available to be used and reported for 1 credit of PDH for your CSI certification requirement, and that is typically why people would request their certificate. Additionally, a reminder to everybody that in that survey will be an option for you to select whether or not you'd like to be added to the specifying community. For those that don't know, CSI does have an online community dedicated to specification writing and reading, and you can join that at any time for free of charge if you're a member or not. You can either request in that survey and I'll add you manually, or feel free to go to csiresources.org and then search under the communities and join by yourself. With that, then, I do want to hand it off to Dave and Lewis to get started with the call. So Dave and Lewis, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. This is Dave Stutzman. I'm coming to you today from soggy Chicago, gray, overcast, and raining all day. I'm here to actually presenting in about an hour to GlassCon Global about certification for glazing contractors. So looking forward to that. Lewis?
I'm coming to you from Nashville, and they're predicting the possibility of thunderstorms this afternoon. I did hear some thunder earlier, but right now the sun is shining. It's a little bit cloudy. So
I'm sending it your way.
We may get a little tail end of the hurricane here in a day or two when it hits the land and starts to come up through the valley.
So Lewis, you came up with this idea for today.
Now, don't blame me.
No, well, okay, it was a joint effort, but you suggested the topic.
True.
We both agreed to it.
I think we have done this sometime in the dim past, but we thought, Dave and I talked about it and thought it might be worth revisiting. Who knows, we might even have some new ideas.
Well, and some of the things, working as an independent specifier, we're always seeing difficulties going between drawings and specs. And just recently, I was asked actually to review a set of specifications that one of our clients prepared. Prepared might be a generous term, because I actually discovered that they were copying things from previous projects, because this is a housing project, just like all the others that they've done. But what you discover is that, hey, no, the project is never the same. It's never just like the other. And then trying to get everything coordinated has, gosh, I spent probably the better part of 4 days just reviewing documents and making comments to them.
Okay. Well, why don't we get started then? And well.
You're driving, so
I know, that's why.
We're taking your license away.
Okay. Well, according to the AIA document A201, the General Conditions of the Contract for Construction, paragraph 121, it says the contract documents are complementary. What is required by one shall be as binding as if required by all. I once, back in the mid 80s or early 80s, I had an argument with my boss, and I had an argument with the contractor on one of our projects who claimed that if it wasn't in the drawings and in the specs, he didn't have to supply it. But we pointed out this paragraph, and he quickly capitulated.
That's an interesting interpretation.
Yeah, it is. And that the so the question is, what does complementary mean?
Ah, you're a fine spec. What a great detail.
So one of the meanings is mutually fulfilling each other's lack or being complements of each other. And so we have a little mathematical expression here of complements. 1 over x and x over 1 are complements. And the product of complements is, hooray, unity. And so the drawings and the specifications are organized differently. They have a different nature, but when you put them together, they should produce unity if they're well coordinated. But that brings us to the next question.
Well, yeah, a single description coming from both drawings and specs, really, how is that possible? So, yeah, what does that coordination mean? Trying to get them to actually say something individually and not overlap, not contradict?
That's right. The harmonious functioning of parts. One of the things that, well, so that's the concept of complementary. Now, when you're doing a project, folks, be on the lookout for if someone is using non-A201 general conditions. One of the things that lawyers who write those documents almost always do is there's a paragraph somewhere that will list the order of precedence. And the order of precedence in the AIA document is the drawings and specs are at the same level. And if you don't understand what's going on, send in the architect and RFI. Whereas almost all lawyer written general conditions that I've run across, the specifications always take precedence over the drawings, always.
That's because lawyers can read. So
You're being kind.
Well, and
the other explanation is because lawyers can misread written documents.
And if there are too many words, that can absolutely happen. But, you know, realistically, it's what the judge is going to understand, the jury is going to understand, and the lawyer understands. It's a written document.
As a claims manager for 10 years for a major architectural firm, I can aver that the specifications, I don't care what the contract says, everybody's going to think, and it's hard to say this with a straight face, David, but I'll try, even though you can't see my face, that everybody is going to think that architects and engineers put more energy into specifications and intensity into the specifications than they do into drawings. It's not to say the same amount of time, but that architects and engineers think that specifications are significantly more important than drawings.
And that's interesting, especially considering, I think, what the general impression within the industry would provide. Because it's been shown previously that architects spend very little time, very little fee dedicated to specifications. So it could be a lopsided interpretation.
That's yes.
Plus, with the order of precedence, the biggest hazard is unintended consequences. Because with an order of precedence, if there's a conflict between documents, as it's written or as it's drawn, the order of precedence eliminates the conflict.
Yes.
So the contractor need not even ask because the contract documents told him how to proceed.
Okay. And which bears out the point that when I was an in-house specifier, I'd walk through the drafting studio and say, draw it the way I write it, boys.
You were well ahead of the curve.
Okay. One of the documents that's available in our industry, a standard document, is the uniform location of subject matter. Now, it does not cover the difference between drawings and specs, and we will talk about that in a little while. But this is a document that if you're not familiar with, I urge you to get a copy. It'll cost you money if you order from the AIA, but I believe if you go on the EJCDC website, you can download a PDF for free. And here's what it looks like in a blow up. And so we have separates out the procurement requirements from the contract documents. And there are the categories of the agreement, the general conditions, supplementary conditions, division 1, and then the product sections. And then there's a alphabetical list of various subject matter, such as discrepancies, and where is that covered. So that's a document that you may want to you should be familiar with and have a copy in your office.
Yeah, and one concept that this document uses, if you can see the key up in the upper left, they do list a primary and a secondary or supplementary kind of a role or statement about each or at least some of the subject matter. So in the case of the dispute resolution, you can see the primary requirements should be specified in the general conditions, and any supplemental requirements then in the supplementary conditions. And depending upon what the subject is, you'll see those bounce around, and that you should always try to deal with following the primary location to ensure that the document or the information is easily found, because that's the whole idea behind construction documents and CSIs. Say it once, say it in the right place. If we do say it in the right place, people are able to find it. If we misuse the place, it might be in the documents, but very difficult to find.
Because there are just thousands and thousands of little bits of information scattered throughout the contract documents. And so some sort of method to make it easy to retrieve those the necessary information is really critical. And this is one of the documents that helps, as well as section format, page format, master format, unit format, and PPD format, and other publications of CSI. So, well, here's a subject near and dear to David's hearts: owner project requirements.
Yeah, where do we capture these things? Do they actually exist? What do you say? What are you suggesting, Louis? That they're under the file cabinet?
I'm suggesting that there's probably only one printed copy, and it's lost in the bottom, the back of the bottom file cabinet drawer that's probably locked, which means that nobody on the drawing team actually ever sees it.
Yeah, so one of the things, and if you're attending Construct this year, you'll hear more from me about owner project requirements. I'll be doing a presentation that is on the periphery, but involves owner project requirements. I really believe it's something that must absolutely be documented up front, because this is one of the best ways to actually coordinate the drawings and specifications. If you know what the owner's expectations are, then that can more easily guide the document developments to be able to satisfy those requirements. If you don't know anything about the requirements or they're not documented so that they're easily referred to by the design team, things are going to get missed.
Yes, which is my last bullet there. Some years ago, I led a team that did a peer review of a very large, complex project, a major new hospital, that there were 3 buildings on the site. And when I got a hold of the owner project requirement document, I made a checklist. And so as we, the team, were checking the documents to see if the things were met, we found that at the end of CDs, about a third of the things listed in that document were not embodied in the contract documents. That went into our report. So I'm not sure what the owner did about it.
So I like your second bullet, Lewis. Is it current? Because here's some of the experience that we see when there are owner project requirements, or say during schematic design, the architect might prepare a basis of design or a design narrative to describe the project. We get to schematic design to try to begin, or design development to try to begin an outline specification perhaps. One of the very first questions I ask, where is the owner project requirements design narrative? Where are the comments that resulted from having issued this document? And generally the answer is there are no comments. So meaning that the design team did an absolute perfect job, that the design can progress without any changes because the document was just absolutely perfect. Now, we all know that that's not true. And even when we get to the end of design development, if we're writing an outline spec, we go to start the construction specs. I mean, this all flows through. That, again, we ask for comments on the outline spec, and generally, there are none. So here we start the cycle all over again. So it's the currency of each of these documents is actually critical to be able to ensure that coordination can actually happen. Because if they remain static and things change and people are referring to outdated information, of course things are going to be fouled up.
Say, David, has Conspectus ever written or helped an owner develop their owner project requirements?
We have, primarily as bridging documents to solicit design build proposals.
Yes. Yes,
And,
I've done that too, of course, many years ago.
And that actually, the one project that we did, the first in the state of New Jersey for a publicly bid school, was turned out just exceptionally well. Everybody involved was absolutely thrilled with the process and the result, because we could measure the design result against the OPR. And that was the last design build public school project the state did, because it worked so well. At least that's my opinion.
Yes. Come on. Okay. So we have contract documents, and the question is, where do we put all this wonderful information that we're developing that are going to be contractual requirements? Where do we put it so that we know where it is, and so that it's the contractor, the mechanics who are working on the job site can easily retrieve that information? So what kinds of information do we typically put on the drawings?
I think that one's easy, Louis. If you can
Well, that's why I
count,
gave you the question.
oh, well, thanks. If you can count it or you can measure it, it belongs on the drawings.
Okay.
I don't know how much more simple to make it. You know,
True.
we don't need gobs of notes on drawings. That's why we have specifications. We certainly don't need to label materials as though it's a specification on the drawing, because that's probably going to conflict with the specification.
Yes. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Well, unless you want to abandon the spec book and just put everything on the drawings, and that's possible. But that's got to be a conscious decision early up front.
Yeah, so, you know, for little tenant improvement projects, one of the offices I work in, I created a set of very, very brief specifications that could be put on the drawings. Partly because on a tenant improvement project, you have one contractor who is doing all of the project's tenant build outs in a building. So he's not going to want to goof up and lose that steady work. So you can trust him to, or her, to do the stuff that should be done, that you don't have to put quite so many safeguards in there for quality control purposes. So, but there's a lot of information that really is much better conveyed as written information rather than graphic. And of course, that's why we, all of us love the concept of specifications and enjoy writing them. One of the things that I sometimes tell people to explain who outside our industry, what the difference is that to me, drawings are like the story. And I had thought about taking a picture of my copy of Moby Dick and putting it over by the drawings. And then the specifications are the definition of the words that are used in the story. And then having a photo of one of my various dictionaries or lexicons over by the spec. So we're defining the story, the words that are used to tell the story of how to build a building. And then we have the information that can go either way. Schedules. These are usually matrix information. I worked for, when I was a co-op back in the 1960s, I worked for a firm in Cincinnati that had pre-printed door and room finish schedules, sheets that were 8.5 by 11. And rather than having people try to fill out a whole door schedule on a 30 by 42 sheet, you could do it a lot quicker, and it was a lot easier to erase and one thing and another make changes. And then those were bound in with the specifications. And I thought that was pretty hip at the time. So schedules are one thing that can go either way, and there are various things that can be scheduled like that.
Well, and CSI's master format allows for schedules to be inserted into the specifications, usually at the beginning of each division.
Yes.
Or potentially at the end of each specification section. So the real advantage for schedules is it conveys a lot of information quickly.
Yes.
And you left out some of our friends on,
what's that?
On the other side of Division 14.
Oh, yes, yeah. They our engineering friends, bless their hearts, they're really into a lot of schedules, especially lighting and one thing and another.
Right. So yeah, if you have a lot of any one thing, in the case of finishes or even in case of lighting fixtures, trying to convey that information in quickly, schedules work fabulously because you can split out the information into relevant columns, relevant rows. And gosh, I remember when we used to just draw an arrow. You know, if the entire row was the same, we didn't actually type all of that text in.
Right. Or mark it as do over.
Right.
Whatever.
And the one thing I try to impress on some of our clients, and some of them understand and take me up on it, is that if they're going to go and create a schedule, if they have to say the exact same thing, 100 times or 500 times or whatever the number is, if I can say it in a sentence in the spec, there's no point in them trying to provide that information in the spec.
Ah, yes.
So a door schedule is a classic example of that. So if every door on the project is 1 3/4 inch thick, I can say it in a couple of words in the spec, and you don't have to mention it in the door schedule.
Exactly.
Or if you do have a door schedule, the only thing that you have to mention is the doors that are 2 1/4 or 1 3/8. So, whatever we can do to make the communication of the material efficient, essentially saying everything in the right place, say it once, and help the contractor as much as we can so that if we can get the 2,000-page spec book down to 50, as Sheldon would profess, we actually should try to do it. Is he? Good. Yeah. Hey, Sheldon. We're professing what you have always been trying to teach everybody, so hope it works. Maybe they'll get the message.
He says, you bet. Being from the extreme far north, he probably should have said, yeah, you bet.
Okay.
We had a question from Dan B, who says, today, what document governs drawings or specs? And how does this work relative to private or public projects? Please comment on today's marketplace and trends. Well, I think we talked about that a little bit already, Dan. Maybe you came on late, but under the A201 General Conditions, and I believe the other major published sample specs like EJCDC and
consensus docs.
Consensus docs. The drawings and specifications are equal in terms of precedence. And so if there's a question of discrepancy between the two, that has to be resolved by an RFI. However, many owner-written general conditions that are written by lawyers, usually the specifications are going to take precedence over the drawings, which may have unintended consequences that don't make anybody happy.
I would suggest there's one other way. Depending upon you answer or ask. Depending on who you ask. If you ask the specifier, the specs are right.
Now. Hey, well, here's a little bit of trivia before we go to the next slide. Did you know, David, that the A201 regards schedules as being a drawing?
I can't say that I did know that. Do they actually list that as a drawing?
They do.
In the drawing definition?
As part of the definition of the drawings.
There might be some people that disagree. Okay, so if you put schedules in a spec, you have to modify the general conditions?
No, not really. But okay. I thought that was interesting when I ran across it some years ago. Oh, my little cutesy arrows to show that they can slide each way. And you may have both on a given project. They have both. Okay. Tell us about systems, David.
It's all about the systems, just like it says. What I am trying to grasp or wrestle with in this industry is how do we make the connection, because we've been looking at the promise of BIM and being able to connect the drawings, the model, with specifications, and it's been a problem that folks are struggling with. You know, eSpecs is trying it, SpecLink is trying it, but what they're trying to do is they're connecting Revit families that includes multiple components, multiple products, things that would be specified in multiple spec sections according to master format. So you have one family that's ending up connecting with multiple master format spec sections.
Like a wall assembly.
Yeah, and that makes that linking very, very difficult. And it makes it wonder, well, who's going to control the linking? Is it the BIM author, developer? I'm not even quite sure what you call them anymore, the designer, if they're working in BIM. Are they making all those decisions to connect this correct spec back to the family? Is it the specifier making those connections? And with today's specification systems that are out there, it really relies on a mapping. And the mapping is a one-to-many. And it's something that you might have to do for every project, especially if you're not working on the similar project types consistently. So what I'm looking at is, because Revit is systems, Revit families are systems, Uniformat, our descriptions are all about systems. We can make that connection on a one-to-one basis. So now I can describe things in Uniformat as systems and assemblies. I can also describe components of those systems and assemblies. So if it's the exterior wall, I can talk about the cladding, whether it's brick or whether it's wood siding. And from that component, I can now make a direct connection to master format, because I'm down at a product level instead of a system level. Because most master format, now I know I'm going to get arguments from some folks, master format does include some sections that might approach a system or an assembly. I understand that, but for the bulk of the master format sections, it's really about a product or some sort of a manufactured item.
Components. So the everything that's listed in the BIM execution plan under the level of development matrix, each one of those line items could have a written Uniformat description.
Right, and each one of those descriptions then could have multiple
breaks down
components
into the components that would be master format.
Right. So if we're writing Uniformat, if we're taking advantage of that document and we're identifying what those components are early in a design process, those component names become the drawing keywords.
Aha.
So now, if we have the list of keywords or keynotes that we're going to use in Revit, and we have that tied to individual systems in Uniformat, we can take those component names over to master format as the product names, and lo and behold, everything will align.
I think we'll talk about that a little bit more a little later. Well, as a matter of fact, look at bullet number 3.
There you go. Okay.
So here's some basic concepts for coordination. Remember, where everything is working together to accomplish some goal. Everything drawn is also specified. Nothing specified that ain't in the drawings. And terminology, which is a big issue these days. And then talk to us a little bit about the advantage of generic terminology, Dave.
Sure. Well, let me address a question. Jay Wisenan. Thanks, Jay. Glad you could join us today.
Oh, yes.
He says, a significant gap in the BIM documentation process is the generic level many staff use to prepare the BIM. Okay, and I would agree with you, Jay, but I would also say that the architects that we're dealing with, what I hear them tell me is they want to work generically in the model for as long as is possible. And with the implementation of uniformat, I said, go knock yourself out. That's fine. All you have to do is let me know what are the systems and assemblies that you're using. And within Revit, there's a place in the properties window called assembly code. And that's the uniformat number that comes pre-populated, Revit out of the box. All we need to do is get that one number correct. So if we have an exterior wall in Revit, label it B2010, falls into exterior wall. You can tack whatever extension you want onto it. I can schedule those assembly codes out of Revit. I can look at uniformat and say, do I have a B2010 exterior wall assembly described? You know, because they have it in the model, I should have an exterior wall in my assembly. So
and some of our the architects that we're working with are showing diagramming exterior wall types and roof types, if there's more than one kind of roof, in such a way that they're describing these assemblies, and then they could use that terminology instead of pointing to all the constituent pieces of the wall. They can just point to it and say exterior wall 1 or exterior EX-3.
So, and I would agree. I mean, the uniformat forces us to think about systems and assemblies. So if you can think about detailing a snapshot of the field or the center of the assembly, no intersections. So if you have exterior wall, just think about the exterior wall, no intersection with the parapet, the roof, the floor, just the exterior wall. Label it exterior wall 1.
Which is the way BIM thinks about it. It's an object.
Right. Then you have the second exterior wall, create a different assembly. Exterior wall 2. Label each one of the components in the exterior wall assemblies, and you only have to say it once. Then when you use exterior wall 1, you just call it exterior wall 1. None of the components need to be labeled because you've already identified them. And the only real detailing that must be done is the intersection between assemblies.
Yes. Yes.
And that's where all the problems usually occur. So if you can concentrate your time on the intersections and getting those right, we'll have a far better result than trying to just spending time labeling a bunch of stuff that it could be done much more efficiently.
Alan Itzkowitz has a comment on this issue. He says, to me, the coordination of terminology has been one of my pet peeves. The architects always use a standard set of abbreviations that are never edited for any specific project. And many times the abbreviations do not match the terminology of the standard available master specification systems. Yes, the non-standard terminology, whether it's their abbreviations or my bête noire on that one, Alan, is abbreviating manufacturer as MFG rather than MFR. Ain't no G in manufacturer. But anyway, some of the younger folks don't know some of the industry standard terminology for things. So instead of referring to insulating glass, they will call it
insulated
glazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that kind of terminology, I would be less concerned about that kind of confusion than, if it was used consistently, it really doesn't matter, because then it goes back to your analogy of the specs being the lexicon for the drawings. If we're using it the same throughout, it really doesn't matter.
True.
Okay,
Sure.
but if we can minimize the amount of terminology that we need, I think we'll do everyone a gigantic favor, because I think of, selfishly, my position as independent specifier, when I get a wall section sheet and I have 4 or 5 wall sections on that sheet, and every wall section is fully labeled. Even if everything is identical except for those intersection details, I must read every note on that entire sheet, because one may be different.
Absolutely.
And the estimator and contractor are forced into the same thing. So just by doing that kind of a behavior or a way of marking up the drawings, you're causing a tremendous amount more time that is required to comprehend that drawing.
And Alan, we'll come back to your concept here in just a minute. On the specs team side, we have the drawing review, repeat as necessary, coming up with a preliminary work plan, interviewing the project team to see, because again, as both Alan and David have mentioned, there are discrepancies sometimes between what people call items on the drawings and what the industry standard terminology is. So we have to sometimes figure out what they really mean so that we can come up with a work plan. One of the things that we're experimenting with, and by a work plan, I mean I probably should have shown an example, is a spreadsheet that lists the spec sections, has room for the dates when they're completed or checked it off or whatever, room for notes and comments about the content and so forth. That one of the things that we've been experimenting with some of our clients is sharing that work plan by putting it on Google Docs so that they can add comments in their little comment column at the end and monitor the progress of the production of the specs.
Yeah, so it becomes a live coordination tool. And hopefully they're actually looking at it and paying attention, because we're identifying the terminology that's going to be used. And if they do pay attention, then they can use the same terminology on the drawings.
Yes, and speaking of drawing terminology, Tommy Smith reminded me that, of course, a lot of firms like to use keynotes, and that can save a lot of time in writing. One of the firms I worked for in the 1960s, David, we wrote the notes with the slant. You remember the little Ames tool that you use to create the the lines, guidelines for the notes, but it also had a slanted edge. It's like 72 degrees or something like that. And this firm required us to write notes in lowercase rather than uppercase because you could get more on the line.
Oh gosh, really? All right.
So how's the drawing team? What kind of coordination activities do they need to do, David?
Hey, how about just talk to the rest of the team? Does that count for anything?
Like bullet 3?
Yes. Communication. Yeah, gosh, if you put something new on a drawings, let's let the team know about it. If you're adding a material to a drawing that, especially if you're using keynotes, I'll go back to Tommy Smith. If you're using keynotes and you have a defined keynote list and the keynote doesn't exist, hey, let the specifier know you have to add a new keynote, a new material that nobody knew about.
In bullet 4, It kind of speaks to Alan's concern about using arcane abbreviations that are not defined or ill-defined. But we've all seen sets of drawings with the boilerplate language that, and I guarantee you, if you read some of that stuff, there will be contradictions with what is required for the project at hand. So they have to be edited down.
Yes, an excellent example of that is structural general notes, because they tend to specify the products on the drawings, and then they specify the products in the spec.
Yes.
And they often don't match.
Definitely, they don't.
So which governs, going back to the questions from earlier, what does govern? What does the contractor actually bid? You know, it's probably going to be a qualified bid, which doesn't help anybody.
Either that or they're going to bid the more expensive of the two, just to be on the safe side.
Unless it's public bid, and then you're going to have to scramble to get what you really want if it's the more expensive.
Alan has a comment. It says, Lewis, don't get me started on general notes, especially structural, like David just said while I was writing this. Okay, David, or Alan, we'll have to have a drink at the convention next month.
Yeah, we can commiserate then.
Yeah, we can cry on each other's shoulders.
Okay, but we do want to, whatever we can do with the drawings, if they're, I won't say necessarily need to be shared weekly, if they're shared regularly at some reasonable interval, well, when the whatever changes that may have been made are more meaningful than just sliding a door 6 inches one way or another. If you can actually do a review of the drawings ongoing, coordinated with the spec, and if we can find a way that the spec is available while it's in progress, so that folks have access to the current information instead of waiting until the end of the phase and the specifier throws the book over the wall at the design team and they go and publish it. So, you know, there's got to be more sharing to make sure that this coordination happens.
Well, is BIM changing the balance between drawings?
Not at all.
Specs?
Do you think?
No, I don't think so either, because right now there are technical limits on how much data you can put into BIM, because we all know one of the problems that the IT folks were always fussing about at my last project, the last firm, was that the architects, instead of drawing some complex item, they would simply snag a Revit object from a manufacturer. Well, the problem is that those manufacturers drew very, very complicated three-dimensional models, and you start putting a few of those things into your job, and all of a sudden it takes a long time to open the sheets because there's just too much data. So the idea of being able to put lots and lots of text into BIM on the level of normal specifications is not really ready at the moment. To go back to the previous slide, Sheldon Wolf has a comment. What we need is the Vulcan mind meld.
Hey, Sheldon, I agree. That would
showing
help.
his age.
That would help.
Unless all team members attend all meetings, we have no choice but to have faith in the information we receive from above. The owner's project requirements have a lot of valuable information, but they also have conflicts and incorrect information. Well, we might add, they often have options too. So having direct access by the entire team may lead to mistakes and further conflicts. Similarly, information obtained at meetings, which may contradict existing information must be summarized for the rest of the team. Clarifications of questions and comments often are oral, which may help one person, but no one else, and do not modify the information in other places.
Well, and I would add one thing, Sheldon, in working as an independent specifier, we seldom even receive design meeting minutes. So even though we ask, it's rare that we see them. So there is one gigantic risk point for the owners and for the design team. So if they're having detailed discussions about materials and they're not sharing with the specifier, there's precious little hope that the specifier will know the detail of what was being discussed and probably will not reflect it correctly in the specification.
Although Sheldon says it's not much better being an in-house specifier. You're still subject to.
Well, thanks for that confirmation, but that's a sad state, Sheldon.
Steve Groth has a comment. He says, I've seen a trend in the industry toward more generic specifications that cover all typical products, for example, 5 or 6 different types of drywall, and let the drawings convey if the product applies to the project. If it's not on the drawings, the thought is that you disregard that portion of the spec. I've seen this approach pushed by architects in the interest of minimizing spec writing time and confirmed by contractors as becoming more prevalent. My initial reaction was horror, but after thinking about it for a while, I'm beginning to think, why not? Well, I have a funny story about that, Steve. When I was working for a firm down in Memphis, we did a project. There was a mechanical engineer that had been soliciting us for work. And so they finally let them have a smallish job, not a real big one. And when I got in their specifications, I realized that that's exactly what they had done. They had just taken their spec masters and printed them out, and they had not edited them to be project specific, and which I thought was not such a good idea. The problem is that you wind up with so many RFIs that can really slow down the project and significantly, as well as expend a lot of time, valuable time that should be spent doing something else. So I wrote back and said, and I rejected their specs and said, look, you've got to make these specs project specific. And the response was, well, if that's the way you want to be, we don't want to work for you in the future, but we'll do it on this one.
Yeah, and I agree with your assessment that it's going to end up resulting in RFIs, because if the contractor sees something in the spec and can't find it, if I were the estimator or the contractor, my assumption is it's required somewhere. I just can't find where it's actually located, so I'm going to ask. So you're going to spend time trying to respond to those kinds of questions.
Dan B has a follow-up comment to Steve Groth. He says, on a multi-building project, parenthesis, renovation or new out-of-the-ground buildings or site work, end quote, end parentheses, is it better to provide one large spec to cover all construction types, or to provide custom, and I think he means individual specs for different parts of the project? That's kind of related to the concept of multiple work packages. But if you do have multiple buildings, it all depends upon how different the buildings are from one another. Ideally, they could certainly share Division 1, but you may want to edit down the project manual to delete out the product sections that don't apply to building A, and write additional sections that apply to only to it, that don't apply to buildings B and C. So that's not an easy question to answer. What do you think, David?
Well, and I think it's going to depend upon somewhat how you organize the overall project, because we've done some where we try to identify, even in the summary article of the specification, as to how the project or how that section applies to multiple parts of a project or multiple phases of a project, because we may issue a section very early, but we don't have all the scope covered for the entire project. Masonry is a great example, because we might have exterior masonry cladding on the building, and we might have exterior masonry site wall that doesn't get developed until much later in the project, and we don't even have a clue about the details. So we try to describe the scope as it relates to each part of the project, and then add appropriate information later. Could we write completely independent spec sections? We probably could. It'll mean more effort on the spec development side, and whether or not it could hurt the coordination, because now you have you may need the same sorts of materials, but you're now specifying each of the materials multiple times, and trying to ensure that you get the same materials throughout might be problematic.
One of the things that you could do, Dan, is to, in the section includes paragraph or article, actually state where in the project the items apply. If they only apply to one building, you can say, oh, the glass supported railing and the lobby of building C, for example.
Yeah, and that's what essentially what I'm saying, using the summary article to try to do that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So we're getting back to our slide here. One of the things that's really frustrating, of course, is we want to be able to access the files of the BIM some point in the future. If we're storing the specifications in there and not just printing out paper, how do we retrieve that? And right now there are severe limits on interoperability, which the industry, that was a bait and switch, because it hasn't been that long before one of the reasons why people were advocating BIM is that it would have a greater interoperability between the different software publishers than was true for CAD. So that whether you drew it in Revit or Bentley, you could be able to read a given BIM model, but that's really not the case. And in many cases, you even have to have the right version of the software to be able to read old documents. And then our last item, of course, is the BIM technician. Like David, I don't know what, you can't call him a drafter anymore.
That's a mystery to me. I'm not sure what terminology to use there.
Or, in CAD days, we used to refer to the CAD jockeys. But anyway, is the BIM input person qualified to make and to document product decisions? So do we really want that person who's, a year or two out of school, or maybe less, deciding what type of glass is going into the building, what kind of brick is going into the building, and so forth? Because it's not going to be the case that the project architect or the project manager is going to open up the model and go in and put that information in.
Right.
That's just not going to happen.
So identify the assembly, call it a day.
True. So here's we're getting near the end. We need to wrap things up. Here are some typical requirements that are not yet practical to put into BIM. And you could as you will notice, after Division 1 there, which it looks a lot like section format, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's all the administrative kinds of things, really,
And quality
because
control and installation.
because it's not product specific necessarily, so it's not related to, you mentioned the manufacturer's BIM objects. They're not necessarily going to be concerned about any of these. They're really concerned about defining the product itself, and that because the drawings per se are all about what you can measure, what you can count, none of this actually applies.
Well, we need to let all these good folks who have given generously of their time to listen to you and me, David, to give them the opportunity to get back to making a few bucks for the companies that they work for.
Right. Well, and we enjoyed all the conversation that we had with them as well.
We really do. That's what makes this so much fun for David and me, because you never can tell what Sheldon or Alan, what curveball they're going to throw to us that we have to try to field.
Yep. So we need to let all these good people know too. Hey, next month, October, the first Thursday falls right in the middle of Construct, CSI's annual meeting and convention. So we're going to have to postpone our meeting until the following week, and I'm trying to find it on the calendar, so it'll be Thursday, October 11, instead of the first Monday of the month.
But we appreciate everyone's interest and participation today, and as I've said before, we regard this as it's your community, it's your organization, so keep those cards and letters coming in, friends and neighbors, and we'll try to talk about whatever you think is important, what's important to you.
All right.
All right.
Matt?
Yes. Well, thank you, Dave and Lewis. Another great hour. Just a couple of people had some questions. So just a reminder, if you didn't see the chat box, this session is recorded. So for those of you that want to revisit it or maybe missed out on some of it at the beginning and want to go back and listen, it will be posted to the CSI YouTube channel probably next Monday. That channel's just youtube.com/ and then CSI Construction. That's all one word. Also, go back and check out all of our previous, I want to say almost 70 sessions now. So more than 2 work weeks worth of knowledge you can learn here from the group. Also, a reminder for everybody, if you did open up this link in a browser, it may have already opened up another tab that will link you directly to the post-event survey. Don't worry if you don't see that, as I will also be sending you all an email later on this evening with a link to that survey. That survey will remain open for the next 5 business days. And please feel free to take that to let us know how we did on this session, recommend additional topics for the future, as well as request a certificate of attendance to this session that can be used for self-reporting for 1 credit of PDH, which stands for Professional Development Hour, as required for maintaining your CSI certifications.
Matt, one last thing.
Yeah.
David and I would love to meet you folks in person. So if you're planning to attend the convention, both David and I will be there, and we would be thrilled if you would look us up and shake us by the hand, and you'll see why we refer to ourselves as having faces made for webinars.
Yes, indeed. I will also be at Construct in Long Beach. So if you ever want to come up and give me recommendations or box my ears for something I did that made life difficult for you, feel free to check me out in the CSI booth. I'll be there for the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday morning of the event. So feel free to look for all of us. If I can work with Lewis and David to find a time where they're both available, which is doubtful because they're both so busy, I may send out an email to let everyone know to meet in the booth at a certain time if we want to have a little meetup. But that'll be dependent on whether or not we can get everyone's schedules to align during that really, really busy time. A last reminder then for everybody is, again, like Dave and Lewis said, our next session will not be until the second Thursday in October. I have already got it booked on my end, but that information is not yet on the website. I will check with Dave and Lewis to just make sure everything else still works before I post that. But at any point you ever want to find and register for a future specification or the contract admin practice group, feel free to go to the CSI website and under the events square on the homepage where it lists all the things by the calendar. Any of them that have already been scheduled will be posted there, and you can feel free to register whenever you want. Additionally, I know we've had a couple of months where we've had issues getting email notifications out to everybody. We're still working on that, but in the meantime, I'll probably continue to send out the direct email from my own Outlook just as reminders as the topics have been decided. Again, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Dave and Lewis, again for another great hour. I know, Dave, you have a back-to-back meeting, so feel free to log off and go about your work day. Thank you, everybody.